Hey everybody, it's Dr. Keegan, and I'm here with another video lecture for our course, Gender and Popular Culture. You may have noticed we are moving into the final major section of the syllabus, which is on genre. So we're going to be studying three different kinds of film genre: horror, action, and melodrama. These are all forms of genre that are considered low forms, and I'm going to talk a bit about that today. There are forms that are classically considered to be somewhat emotionally manipulative, and because of that, are not often taken seriously as high art. But they're very popular genres. They're genres that really saturate North American media. And I want to spend some time thinking about them seriously because one of our tasks as scholars of popular culture is to take forms of culture that are thought of as unserious, as not artistic, seriously, right? So comics, video games, these are other forms that are not considered high art as well that we've already thought about. So in this section, we'll be kind of looking at three different very popular film genres, and a lot of you have chosen to work with one of these texts in your paper or project. So we're going to be reading a little bit about each text. We're going to be practicing with the forms of genre convention in each category. So I'm going to start today talking about a bit about body genres, how they're defined, and we'll talk a bit about temporality or time in genre, and particularly in these three types of genre we're looking at. I want to mention also, I'm going to be sending you some guides for producing your research bibliography and your final paper or project via email. Please go through those. The research bibliography is due December 3rd, I believe. So not for a while, but you do need to be working on it in order to have it ready for when we come back from break. And then your project or paper will be due basically the last day I can give you. I'll give you as much time as possible on that. And I'll clarify that due date for you as soon as I confirm what our actual what our final meeting date should be. We're not going to be having one because we're an async class, but I'll make that the due date for the project or paper so that you have the maximum amount of time to turn it in. I'm posting a guide about how to produce your paper or project also. So look for that in an email from me, and we'll be talking about that more after Thanksgiving. Okay, let's get started. Popular body genres, genre, sensation, and time. So I mentioned in a video maybe 2 weeks back, time is getting weird, about the idea of genre. You might have heard this word in different courses or when people talk about things like pop culture. Um, you might have a working understanding of it, but I wanted to kind of dig in a little further to it today because it's so important to what we're going to be talking about with the films we're watching in class. You should be watching Get Out. I just showed you a still from Get Out. You should be watching that for this week, and that is a horror movie, right? It's a movie that's working with a set of conventions, aesthetic, sensational conventions, narrative conventions that are highly established formula for producing fear, right, in an audience. So a genre is a category of cultural text distinguished by a specific and historically consistent combination of style, form, and content. We know what the style of a horror movie looks like. We know what sorts of narrative things tend to happen in a horror movie. We know how they tend to be edited. We know how they feel when we watch them, right? It's a familiar combination of things. Gone Home is another text that starts us out thinking that this is going to be a horror because of the genre conventions that it starts with: the creepy house, the dark storm, the lack of light, right? The implication of something might pop out at you, right? We're conditioned to expect those things by being exposed to the horror genre. Of course, Gone Home takes that and goes in a different direction with it as a sort of meta commentary on horror. Get Out's doing the same thing, but also takes us kind of into a meta commentary on the racial dynamics of horror. So both are using very clear genre conventions to set up our expectations and set us up to feel certain ways. Um, so there are many, many types of genre. When you think about the basic qualities of a genre, things that we expect to be there, right? For example, one of the earliest American genre types was the Western film. We could think about some of the basic qualities that tend to be in a Western, such as setting, right? Tends to be set in the desert or a partially unsettled location far away from cities, right? That's one kind of precondition of a Western. Two, it's going to be realist in tone, meaning it seeks to represent things as they would appear to us, in a very kind of uh, straightforward way, right? Like there's not magic in Westerns, generally speaking. They're shot so that things appear very photorealistic, right? And that's a real old convention visually in Westerns, as they look the way things look to our eye. They also, the story or narrative in a Western almost always is about a conflict between men with oppositional value systems. The gunslinger and the sheriff, right? The robber and the do-gooder, right? The person who believes in an open territory, and the person who believes in civilization, the person who represents the law and the person who represents the outlaw. They're at loggerheads with one another in a Western over what should be permitted in this sort of partially settled location, right? So the themes there, if we think about the story, it's about this conflict. The themes undergirding that narrative are almost always around chaos versus order. The lawman or sheriff representing order and trying to settle the unsettled place, and the outlaw or indigenous people or some group that isn't ordered, right? Representing wanting to keep the place unsettled, representing a sort of chaos. How this conflict is settled is through highly dramatized violence, usually the gunfight, or the chase sequence, sometimes on horseback, right? And generally, we expect, because the Western is almost always a story about the past, we expect law to prevail over chaos because of the stories we tell about how the West was won, right, from the forces of chaos, or frankly, it's about manifest destiny. It's about white supremacy and its expansion westward in the U.S. context. Therefore, if we take all these points together, we could say that the American Western's ideological structure, right, the story it's telling, the values it's pushing, right, the ideology there is generally focused on the justification of westward expansion, through the civilization of undesirable forms of masculinity, right? It's a story we tell about why it was okay to grab up all that land and forcibly settle it and take it from people who were there, right? The Western is implicated in the ideology of manifest destiny. There are Westerns that push against this and do different things with this formula, and that expose the immorality of manifest destiny, but the undergirding sort of structural ideological forms of the Western are kind of about these things. Okay, so those are the elements we expect to see, and that's the sort of fundamental ideological claim of the genre. So you could think on your own, right, about some other genres and what the basic genre elements of them are. For example, a rom-com. This is a very popular genre. It's also a genre that's not taken seriously, right? The chick flick or whatever. A rom-com is basically about uniting difference. It's about, usually there's a man and a woman. Sometimes we do get now queer rom-coms, but they're almost always separated by class status or by sometimes race, although that's a less common story in the US. So the rom-com is usually about two unhappy people who are living in these different class positions whose lives are incomplete for some reason. They're dysfunctional, they have problems connecting, Their lives are pale and shallow, and through a chance encounter, a chance cross-class encounter, usually because we don't tend to mix with people who are not of our own class background in the United States. We're very class segregated through a chance encounter, sometimes on mass transit. Sometimes if you think about Sleepless in Seattle, it's like a random email gets sent to the wrong person, right? Some kind of chance encounter brings these two different people together, and they have a meet cute, right? And then through coming to understand one another's competing values, they're able to come together and resolve fundamental class differences. So the rom-com is fundamentally a story about overcoming economic inequalities and finding middle ground. It's a very middle class bourgeois kind of genre. A horror film is very different. It's often about some terrible thing that's taken place in the past that it's too late to undo, and therefore we must forget. We must push it down. We must bury it. We must ignore it. We refuse to see it, right? And the monster in the horror movie is always the thing that comes and reminds us of the horrible thing that we're trying not to know. So if rom-coms are about coming together and resolving difference, horror films are about basically repression. They're about the thing that we repress that we can't think about, and about what that does to our consciousness. So they use fear to make us to like shatter repression and make us face the thing, right? Or representations or symbolic metaphors for the horrible thing. Okay. So genres are popular because they speak to fundamental problems: difference, repression, trauma, desire for change, hope for the future, the need to justify past things that have happened in the country, right? So when you ask, like, what are the basic ideological structures of each of these genres, I want you to be thinking about what are the basic messages that a genre contains and communicates, and then why do we as audiences find engaging with those ideological structures pleasurable, right? Rom-com tells us a story that even though we know capitalism is unfair and creates all kinds of sort of all kinds of pain for people, right? All kinds of division. The rom-com promises us that that can be overcome through romance, right? The horror film teaches us that the horrible thing can be managed, can be defeated, or can at least be pushed back into the box, right? One of the conventions of the horror movie is the monster always comes back. It's never fully defeated, but it can be managed, right? Especially by certain types of people who understand the monster better. So the ideological structure of the horror movie is repression. The monster must be faced, and repression must be reasserted over and over and over again, right? For us to have a functioning society. Let's talk a bit about Linda Williams' piece. This is a really famous essay on what she calls body genres. In this piece, she does dig a bit into psychoanalytic theory, which I don't think you really need to pay too much attention to later in the work. I'm just going to cover the things that I think are more important for our context. In the piece, she is seeking to develop a theory of how some film genres work to create specific modes of sensation in the body, right? She calls these body genres. And she says body genres tend to not be taken seriously because instead of getting us to think through a problem, they get our bodies to feel the problem, right? So they're associated with the body. The body and materiality are thought of as being more emotional and feminine and not rational and masculine. Rational genres like the drama, the realist drama, right, are taken a lot more seriously than these forms. So she says these genres create specific sensations, both emotional and physical, in the spectator, us, the people watching. So she says that these excessive, meaning they create too much feeling, too much emotion, right? These excessive genres, which are thought of as low, like horror, pornography, and melodrama, should be taken seriously. She's making an argument for the seriousness of a form that a lot of critics would think are just exploitive, right? And so again, here we are back with cultural studies needing to defend cultural production that's thought of as just manipulative, right? Williams says, no, these genres are popular precisely because they're meaningful, not because they're just exploitive. We're not going to be talking about porn in class. My apologies if you were hoping, but we are substituting the action film here as horror, action, and melodrama as forms of body genres that are super popular, but also like don't win Oscars usually, right? So she calls these three forms of genre body genres, genres that work primarily through the creation of sensation versus intellect or even plot, right? She says the plot is secondary to the feelings that the plot is supposed to be producing. Williams notes that these genres work through mimicry, which we've already studied a bit with games, right? That they attempt to make the audience feel what the screen bodies are experiencing. And so that's kind of whether it's in melodrama, sorrow, in action, a sort of physical intensity and compression of time, or in horror, fear or anxiety, right? We are asked to put ourselves in the sort of emotional or physical position of the characters on screen. That's the main way these genres work. Williams says we should take the feelings that these genres generate seriously as a form of cultural critique or intelligence. She's like, hey, a lot of people really love horror movies. Why is that? We should take that seriously as a cultural function of the genre. It does something for people beyond just, you know, scaring them and getting them to forget about their problems, right? She's like, actually, I think there's actually a form of analysis taking place here when people go to see horror, right? So Williams calls these genres body genres, and she talks about the types of feelings they induce, right? She says that they are too easily dismissed as producing bad forms of pleasure. And here's where she dips into psychoanalysis, saying like, oh, the horror film is masochistic, right? Or, you know, or sadistic, right? And she says, well, these forms of pleasure are thought of as being bad. And she's arguing against that, actually. So she says actually that each genre is what she calls a setting for desire that explores sensation as a form of problem solving. So she says like these genres are introducing these feelings to encourage us to feel through cultural problems that seem unresolvable in real life, like economic inequality, like cultural trauma, like loss, right? When we get to Moonlight, Moonlight is a melodrama, and it is a film about loss and what to do about it. The things that loss does to us, right? But we have to feel the loss the characters are experiencing to then put ourselves in the position of trying to think through the problem, right? So feeling is generated in order to get us to identify with the characters and then work with the characters kind of as audience members to solve those problems. So Williams says porn uses the feeling of seduction to simplify and direct sexual desire towards specific objects. We won't be talking much about that, but we will. We are looking at a horror movie, right? So horror, she says, uses fear to confront the threat of otherness or difference or things that need to be rejected or repressed from consciousness. And melodrama uses what we would call pathos, which is a Greek word for really intense emotions of sorrow and longing and suffering, uses emotional suffering to reveal the violence and loss repressed within traditional family structures. I would open that up even further and say traditional social structures, particularly when we get to Moonlight, not only heteronormativity, but also racial dynamics, okay, and masculinity. So thinking about genres as a way of solving problems on screen that in reality feel like they can't be solved. That's the important thing to take away here. Just a quick chart from her article, right? This could be useful to go back to as you're working, if you're working on Moonlight, Get Out, or Mad Max Fury Road. Mad Max doesn't show up here because she's not talking about action particularly, but action is a subgenre of melodrama that works not through woe, tears, and crying, but through kind of excitation, jubilation, and a feeling of sort of physical mastery of time. Um, what's really important here, I think, is don't pay attention to fantasy perversion. Those don't matter because we're not using psychoanalytic theory in class very much. But thinking about the temporality of these genres, meaning what theory of time are they using to produce feeling? Um, Particularly this idea of horror using the jump scare to make things happen too quickly before we're ready to deal with them, right? Is a way of shattering repression over and over again. The thing that we constantly push back in a way comes too quick, or comes and comes and comes after us, right? Um, Whereas with melodrama, that genre is always about the thing that we should have done that we didn't, the missed opportunity, the if only feeling, where everything happens after some kind of perfect scenario has been lost, which makes us sad, right? So if in horror we're scared by seeing things happening too fast, in melodrama we're sad because they didn't happen when they should have. And so time is a really important component of genre. Um, so time, what I'd like you to think about, and this goes to the discussion prompt that I posted yesterday and I emailed you about, that asks you to think about how Get Out uses fear, how it produces fear, and what it's doing with fear, how it's using fear to get us to confront the horrible thing. And what do you think the horrible thing is in the movie, right? Time creates feeling in these genres. Williams says that body genres are thought to be low forms associated with girls, adolescents, teens, and working class people. Like, think about it. The melodrama is associated with women, horror is associated with teens, and action is associated with working class people, right? So those are groups that are not socially empowered. She says they're thought to be associated with these low positions because they are thought to obviously manipulate the audience, that they're manipulating time to generate feeling, and because of that, they are exploitive genres. She says actually they're not exploitive, they're encouraging us to problem solve through feeling. So in horror, time, I mentioned the theory of time there is that things come too quickly, and efforts to repress don't work, right? So if we're in reality repressing certain information about mortality, about trauma, about things that have taken place in the past that we can't face, right? Americans are great at this. In horror, that thing refuses to stay repressed and comes right up at us, right? So the feeling is like, jump scare, jump scare, right? So the major temporality there is too soon, right? I can't handle this. It's coming before I feel ready, right? In melodrama, I mentioned the temporality is too late. It's always about a missed opportunity. It's always about something that's been lost or could have taken place but didn't, that has produced a traumatic situation. So too late is the temporality there. And the major feeling is like sadness, longing, a sort of longing sadness for something that cannot be actually gotten in the present moment. William says porn, the fantasy of temporality is there is on time, like sexual pleasure is happening seamlessly, even though we know sex isn't that simple, and porn kind of cuts things up and creates a montage to make it seem like sexuality is just this super easy thing to do and have, when really it's not. Sex is far more complicated than that, right? So there's a sort of fantasy of being on time with a partner. And the major feeling there is pleasure or erotic satisfaction. Some other genres, popular genres we could think about when thinking about sports or action films, the temporality there is like time is running out, or we did it just in time. we'll be thinking a bit about this when we look at Mad Max Fury Road, but a lot of that movie is just one long chase sequence where things need to happen just in time for the story to keep going. And the whole story is propelled in a kind of, it goes forward and then it hits a middle point and then it goes back exactly the same way it went forward in reverse. So that film is very much about time and about sequence. Um, the feeling that we get when things happen just in time, especially when time is running out, is jubilation, right? Like whoo, right? Like when your team wins at the last second on the field, you're like, yeah, right? So the temporality there sets us up to celebrate just pulling out the right set of events from an almost impossible situation. That's how action tends to work. Romantic comedy, we talked about before, is about getting two people who are out of time with one another into time with one another. Um, a really famous example of this is Dirty Dancing. The end sequence, we know that that's a cross-class narrative with a middle-class woman and a working-class guy, right? Patrick Swayze being the working-class sort of dangerous guy, and Baby being the protected, Jennifer Grey being the protected baby of a bourgeois family, and they meet at a camp, right, where the workers and the clients are close together. They're separated by their positions in capitalism, but they start dancing together. And over time, Baby gets better and better at dancing. And the final sequence is actually her and I think Johnny is the name of I can't remember, Patrick Swayze, right? They perform this dance for the entire community and they're perfectly in time. And because of that, everyone then can dance together. So it kind of uses the conventions of a musical at the end also to create this feeling of universality from within class difference, resolving class differences through heterosexuality, basically. I had the time of my life, right? That's the ending of the movie. If you haven't seen Dirty Dancing, it's a really good film. I'm going to ask you to think a bit about time in your discussion entry where you're talking about fear, because fear is produced through this too soonness that horror uses. So be thinking about that as you kind of watch the film and pull out instances of this for your discussion. Next week, all we have is a reading on Get Out assigned. I would encourage you to do that reading, especially a lot of you are writing about Get Out. It will help you with your analysis and it will help you unpack more about the film. So enjoy the film. I'll leave this here and be looking for an email from me also about the upcoming assignments for the course. All right. Bye.